Good afternoon, everyone. That's that every time, and I'm surprised every time. Anyway, good afternoon. I'm David Howell. I'm the acting director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations and also professor of history and East Asian languages and civilizations here at Harvard. The seminar is co-sponsored by the Edwin Howell Institute for Japanese Studies. So every year at about this time, but not necessarily on the eve of a major election, we we're kind of new to distract us for a little bit. We honor a scholar or practitioner who's had an exceptional impact on the program's research on contemporary Japan and on U.S.-Japan relations. And so today I'm delighted to introduce the program's distinguished visitor for the 2024-25 year, Professor Laura Hein, the Harold H. and Virginia Anderson Professor of History at Northwestern University. So Professor Hein has published extensively on political and policy history, economic and cultural history, war and empire, and Okinawan studies. Her books include Fueling Growth, The Energy Revolution and Economic Policy in Post-War Japan, 1990, Reasonable Men, Powerful Words, Political Culture and Expertise in 20th Century Japan, from 2004, Imagination Without Borders, Visual Artist Tomiyama Taeko and Social Responsibility in 2010, and Post-Fascist Japan, Political Culture in Kamakura after World War II, 2005. I have worked extensively with Laura. I've known her for a long time, but most recently we've worked together on New Cambridge History of Japan, which she's the general editor. She also edited volume 3 of the 3-volume set, which appeared last year. I edited the second volume on early modern Japan, which came out at the beginning of this year. It was a very rewarding, sometimes agonizing, but ultimately extremely rewarding process. And I think we've gotten lots of kind words about the New Cambridge history from people who have taken a look at it. Professor Hein was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Reischauer Institute previously, some
1,000 years ago.
Anyway, so please welcome me please join me in welcoming Professor Hein for her talk entitled Distant Travels in Methodology, Japan Studies in Visual Artist Tomiyama Taeko.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's lovely to see some familiar faces, and thank you for organized it and made this event possible. And I look forward to getting to know some of the rest of you better. What I'd like to use my time today to do is to introduce the work of Tomiyama Taeko, who is a Japanese artist who passed away 3 years ago in 2021 at age 99, almost made it to 100. And in January of next year, the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum at the University of California, Santa Barbara, will host a major exhibit of her work, Tomiyama Taeko, A Tale of Sea Wanderers, which focuses on a gift of a series called Hiroko and the Puppeteers, which is comprised of 8 large oil paintings and about 20 collages, which were produced in 2007, 2009. This is an artist whom I knew well. I have published about her in the past, and I arranged this gift on behalf of her family. So I'm excited about going to see it. My website, which you see here, is also the best place online in any language to view her major work and get a broader sense of her oeuvre over the decades. I first saw an exhibit by this artist in 1984, but I did not get to know her personally until about 20 years later, by which point her work had become far richer and more profound. She was fundamentally a political person, meaning that she felt an obligation to use her work to advocate in some way for a better society. And I think she's very successful at that. And I'd like to lay out some of her interpretive innovations and why they are so satisfying to me. So I'm interested in identifying what distinguishes effective political art from less good political art, or how to go beyond the statement, I care. Because a lot of work strikes me as sending that message, but not doing much more for that. And the true title for this talk, which I didn't figure out until weeks after I had to give the title to my hosts, is what differentiates good political art from not so good political art. So, and I hope that others agree with me by the end of this hour that Tomiyama has deployed some productive and widely applicable strategies for addressing big intellectual problems, making this good political art. And if not, please just enjoy the gorgeous pictures, because I have no doubts that it succeeds in being good art, in that it is aesthetically powerful, both intellectually and visually. So this series, Hiroko and the Puppeteers, is one of Tomiyama's largest and most ambitious sets. It was produced at the height of her both intellectual and technical powers. It's predominantly a verdant green color, and the paintings and collages depict an undersea journey of a group of Asian masks, dolls, and puppets from Central Asia via rivers to the Chinese coast, and then on to Awaji Island in Japan's Inland Sea, then to the waters off Southeast Asia and the Sepik River area of New Guinea. The travelers, if you look, you can see, they include Malaysian and Indonesian puppets, Polynesian masks, and Lucian's decidedly modern fictional character, AQ, who was created in 1921. He's down in the corner with AQ around his neck there. Tomiyama calls these puppets troubadours, or tabigenin, and also kugutsu, which is another word for puppet, to evoke the medieval wandering artists who carried culture and religion with them, mingling and transmitting ideas freely across open terrain without regard to national borders. The art critiques imperialism, capitalism, and warfare, particularly in Asia. In this undersea world, the puppets and folk gods cast off by human society represent the cultures and ecologies that were left behind when the drylanders rushed to enrich themselves, heedless of the moral and physical destruction they caused. Nonetheless, her paintings make their political points visually and indirectly. Her work is packed with symbols and arguments, not all of which are immediately obvious, thus rewarding us when we linger and give them our full attention. She pulls this off in part by linking her image into series. This is another painting here. Doing so creates both narrative and intertextuality, guiding her viewers towards specific interpretive directions. And this tactic is more didactic in the DVDs that she creates together with music composer Takahashi Yuji, because she adds verbal commentary there beyond the titles of the paintings. In other words, she's not just acknowledging multiple perspectives or providing representation to marginalized voices, in this case, various Asian cultures, although of course she is doing both those things. Rather, the specific images connect in deeply informed ways to larger stories, and the implied logic of those embedded arguments gives the work its greatest social relevance. Sometimes the nature of the connection being asserted is ironic juxtaposition, sometimes it's historic continuity, and sometimes it zooms out to a non-human perspective to remind us that despite our human divisions, we have no choice but to share our planet with each other. So sorry, I'm not going to distract you too much. Tomiyama also thinks like a poet. She layers meanings and images on top of each other, aiming to be as dense as possible. As she said, I like to have as many different things going on in a painting as I can. I think Hieronymus Bosch must have been like that. When you look at his paintings carefully, you notice all sorts of things. Over there in this corner, there's this awful guy. The internal complexity of her images, combined with the ways in which the various pieces relate to each other, is another source of both intellectual and aesthetic pleasure. Another way to put the same thing is Tomiyama is very good at world building, which is a criterion that, for example, is commonly invoked to judge fantasy novels. She doesn't just critique, she creates a complex vision of the crucial figures in an imagined universe that is better than our current one. The work is also both learned and consistent in its references. Tomiyama got the idea of narrative series from Emaki Scrolls, highlighting her deep knowledge about Japanese cultural and artistic traditions. She thinks carefully about how images already imbued with the specific meanings that have accrued in the past, both in terms of the underlying cultural tradition and the ways that other visual artists have represented the same or related images, which this is one of the main criteria and methodologies of cultural historians, and consistency and depth of analysis of the existing fields of reference is a major way that we judge the quality of our own cultural production. So it's how you can tell a good version from a bad version. Tomiyama sometimes builds on these existing meanings and sometimes deliberately repurposes them, but she never ignores them, a point to which I will return. Thus, for example, we can assume that she is invoking the full range of meanings of dragons in East Asian iconography when she includes one, such as these two puppets from collages from the puppet series. So the collages are like Nissan paper size. At the same time, Tomiyama looks for images and ideas that have not been widely used by others, which she analogizes to cooking. When I make collages and when I paint, I like to include images of things as if I am using different kinds of things in the kitchen. I like to have a lot of ingredients on hand, things that other people wouldn't think of using, unique things. One reason I picked images from Taoism and the astrology of Taoism for my current series is that no one else uses these things. And there's some of that in these images. To be clear, like most visual artists today, Tomiyama also prizes the reader's freedom to reinterpret her work. For example, I once referred to the central animal in this image as a deer, but it is actually a horse. And she was very happy to let me think of it as a deer, but actually I much prefer a horse, her real intention, because the image is from a series set on the Central Asian plains, and while both animals are indigenous to that region, historically horses have played a far more important role in the transmission of human culture across huge distances, which is one of the themes of that series. And this image and the meanings encoded in it from 1994 actually led directly to the puppet series because it focused Tomiyama's attention on the geography of cultural transmission. She just moved from land to sea. Her inspiration was a specific memory from her first trip to Central Asia in 1967 when she visited the Bamiyan Buddhists. On that visit, she passed by a wedding celebration where local Afghanis were playing music. And the melodies reminded her of the musical accompaniment to puppet performances she had heard as a child on Awaji Island. Of course, when she recalled this memory 40 years later, it was overlaid with the knowledge that the Taliban had destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas a couple of years earlier in 2001, and had also strictly limited what forms of music could be played or sung, leaving many Afghani artists to flee into exile. So she chose kugutsu, the term for the title of the series, because that word for puppets derives from the Sogdian language spoken long ago as the lingua franca of Central Asia and native to people who lived near the Bamiyan Buddhists, as you can see from this map. One way this is political art is that she accepts responsibility for helping to keep alive the memory of these faraway creative artists because they were newly under duress. The songs that most closely match those Tomiyama heard in Afghanistan were ones performed at New Year's festivals in honor of the deity of fishermen and sea voyagers, Ebisu, which is a little surprising considering how dry it is where the Bamiyan Buddhists are. So she made Ebisu into one of the main travelers in this journey. Ebisu is associated with jellyfish, sea bream, and the inland sea region, all of which show up in the paintings. Ebisu is also in charge of keeping the ocean floor pristine and sending flotsam from the sea onto shore, a point relevant to the paintings as well, as you will soon see. Ebisu helps Tomiyama highlight folk culture. She linked him to the art forms engaged in by amateurs because she likes to erase the distinction between high art and low art media that she had been taught in art school. And so, for example, she includes in this embroidery, which her mother did, the needlework of fishing nets, which is another symbol for Ebisu. And as musicologist Oh Chifumi explains, Ebisu has long been associated with musical performance, particularly when combined with Shinto kagura and puppet theater presentations. These traditionally take place at various shrines, including Miho Shrine in Shimane Prefecture, which has a big collection of donated musical instruments. Some of these instruments, including a drum that was donated earlier than the 16th century, were washed ashore, sharpening the idea that music, culture, and good fortune all arrive along sacred sea roads. So Fabio Rambelli, who teaches at Santa Barbara, tells us that Ebisu is linked to an ancient inland sea area practice of building little unmanned boats in order to float ritual pollution away from human society towards the sea. And these boats, this idea eventually morphed into the takarabune, or the ships that carry the 7 gods of good fortune, one of whom is Ebisu. Many of you know this perfectly well, I realize. Turning the ships into welcome symbols of good fortune rather than serving as vehicles to avert ill fortune. Moreover, they carried the promise of redistribution of wealth. Rambelli explains, particularly in the Edo period, wealth given by the gods to commoners was often associated with an expectation of social and political reform, or yonaoshi, which at times developed into open rebellion. Some of these associations between divine wealth and a better, more equitable society may also have been present in takarabune imagery. And he goes on to argue that the prevalence of this belief in the late Edo period is a mark of the spread of capitalism and a social response to its disruptions, which is an analysis that completely harmonizes with Tomiyama's interpretation. And Tomiyama actually brought in a second patron deity of fishermen to criticize the commercialization of Asian societies and the attenuation of the cultural resonances and religious meanings of traditional art forms. And that's the Chinese folk goddess Mazu, who also watches over those who travel by sea and by extension blesses commercial operations. In Tomiyama's narrative, the puppets were decimated by imperialism and war, but also were consigned to their watery graves by human disinterest as Asian people turned to a civilization of greed and the mass amusements of cinema and television. And they no longer prayed to Mazu and Ibisu for spiritual inspiration, but only for material prosperity. So I thought it was really funny when I went onto the website of the Nishinomiya Ebisu Shrine near Kobe to get this image. But I then discovered that the shrine advertises Ebisu financier cakes baked by the very elegant Henri Charpentier confectioner through their linked trilingual website. You can get them in Chinese as well as in English and in Japanese, making Tomiyama's point that trans-Asian capitalism has inserted itself into organized religion far more powerfully than I had anticipated. Tomiyama is also deliberately decentering Japan, both as a nation and a modern empire, through the puppet's itinerary. They begin their journey in Central Asia and ended in the South Pacific. And the Japanese stops are just along the way, neither the origin nor the culmination of the voyage. And the same thing is true for the Chinese stops. I think it's also significant that this woman, who has lived in Tokyo since 1938, omits the capital city from the puppet's itinerary, choosing other Japanese places as her ports of call and disaggregating the nation as she does so. Ebisu is a Kansai figure, and Tomiyama grew up close to his shrine near Kobe. Her parents were from Awaji. And these inland sea locations are stops on the sea road, along with Java, New Guinea, and Taiwan. This is a global story, not a nation-to-nation one. Tomiyama uses Ebisu to assert the value of traditional cultural practices in ways that diminish the nation state in yet another way as well. The leading theory of Ebisu's origin is that he evolved from the abandoned firstborn leech child of Izanagi and Izanami. These founding deities of Japan rejected their boneless child by casting him out to sea in a reed boat, quite possibly from Awaji Island, which is where their central shrine is located. According to the 8th century Kojiki, the leech child was not counted among the children of these deities for the reason that the latter abandoned him as soon as he was born, he being a failure. And this Hiruko, or leech child, magically became the fisherman's protector, Ebisu, either while adrift on the ocean waters, or in some versions, after being taken in and cared for by non-Japanese fishing people on other shores, thriving due to the compassion of strangers towards a discarded and deformed child. Like many Japanese of her generation, Tomiyama is explicitly rejecting the ideology of the emperor system, which she sees as having encouraged millions of people to accept what in retrospect were extraordinarily cruel and self-defeating policies. And including Izanami and Izanagi, of course, ties the series to the origins of both Japan and the imperial family. For her, their callousness towards their firstborn child telegraphs an original moral failing at the heart of imperial Japan. Invoking the puppeteers who brought her Ebisu worship back to Awaji in the intervening centuries conveys the same message. The puppeteers are outside the caste system and therefore have the power to topple the divisions between sacred and profane. I particularly enjoy the centrality of feminism in Tomiyama's work. She's thought hard about how to handle the fact that most traditional cultures, local as well as national, popular as well as elite, have been terrible for women, even when they offer anti-capitalist critiques. And a major explanation for the extraordinary hardiness of misogyny across the globe is that it is so intricately braided into so many cultural traditions and therefore seems precious because it is unquestionably culturally authentic. Here, Tomiyama's strategy is to creatively close off the versions that encourage subordination of women by rewriting the ancient past. And she does so by celebrating the leech child's survival and metamorphosis into Ibisu. So why do we need a new origin story? She is rejecting the standard explanation of how Japan's founding deities came to produce a defective child in the first place. In that tale, Izanami, the female deity, took too much initiative in the sexual encounter that led to the Hiroko's conception, and her boldness somehow inflicted lasting damage. This gratuitously sexist element, which actually makes no sense in the context of other ancient Japanese myths, such as that of Ame no Uzume, whose body dance lured the sun goddess out of her cave, was the first thing to go in Tomiyama's version. And I might add here that Tomiyama is not alone among feminists in rethinking this myth. Kirino Natsuo recently did so in the Goddess Chronicle, as did her translator, Rebecca Copeland, in Diva Nation, which also has an article by Barbara Hartley analyzing the Ame no Uzume myth, which you see on the cover. Tomiyama herself developed this myth-busting strategy after reading a translation of Robert Graves' The Greek Myths, which interprets Greek mythology as bearing the traces of a historic struggle between an older matriarchal tradition and a later patriarchal one. As she explains, he found at the source these myths had emerged at a very unsettled time when the society was undergoing dramatic change from matrilineality to patriarchy. There are many examples from the myths of powerful goddesses and tales of reorganization and consolidation of a patriarchal system under Olympus. The main thing is to understand we no longer need this imperialist patriarchal structure. We need to think of ways to imagine other possibilities. And her point is that her feminist anti-racist versions of Asian myths are at least as true to contextual tradition as are the standard stories. Both are ideological assertions about how the past might have been organized, equally solidly grounded in evidence. And here too, she is following criteria that are very familiar for judging history scholarship. To reiterate, reinterpreting ancient myths is a profoundly political act designed to undercut the validity of basic assumptions about how societies have always worked. And Tomiyama is here really aligning herself with transnational feminist theory. She included among her friends were several translated of American second wave feminist thinkers, of whom the best known in Japan was Kate Millett, because Millett lived in Tokyo and taught English at Waseda in the early 1960s. In fact, she published Sexual Politics in, I'm missing an image. In 1972, the same year that Tomiyama illustrated a book of translations of Greek myths. Reassessing the Bible as well as Greek mythology, Millett argues there that primitive society practices its misogyny in terms of taboo and mana, which evolve into explanatory myth, and that both sides of Pandora and Eve, stories of Pandora and Eve, assign the dangers of evils of sexuality exclusively to women, that condemn the female through her sexuality and explain her subordinate position as her well-deserved punishment. And I think it's fair to assume that Tomiyama was familiar with this work, which came out at the same time as this book, which she did the illustrations for. Tomiyama pursues the same logic in her standalone 1983 painting, Those Who Fly in the Sky, which is modeled on this ancient Chinese silk funerary banner, which was discovered in the early 1970s at Mawangdui. The central image is of the founder of China, King Fuxi, going to heaven in a chariot pulled by dragons. And she looked at that and she thought, why is the king in a chariot? A woman giving birth is far more important. And it's Osama and Osan, of course. Hence, her central image for representing the origins of political power is a standing woman assisted by attendants while giving birth, which is a traditional style in China and Japan. So she's reorienting the origin stories of both places. To return to the puppet journey, Tomiyama was further demoted the imperial system and brought her critique up to the modern era by including Puyi, the puppet emperor of Manchuria, and also the Showa emperor, as troubadour actors in Theater Beneath the Sea, splendid banquet for the goblins and demons of empire. So that's Puyi and his lady there. And then this rather pig-like image of the emperor is why I wanted to find a home for this series outside of Japan, because I thought it would be much more likely to be on exhibit if it left the Japanese islands. These aristocratic figures share the watery stage with Chinese revolutionary feminist Chu Jin, fan dancers, and multi-eyed catfish demons, who I think are there because they're fun to paint. Another way that this is a feminist reorientation of tradition and culture is through its prominent inclusion of historical feminists among her puppet troubadours. I just mentioned Chu Jin, a fiery orator, poet, and women's rights activist. And you can identify her by the first four characters from her final statement, Autumn Winds and Autumn Rains, which was her poem before she was executed by the Chinese state in 1907 for demanding political change. I'm pretty sure that Tomiyama encountered her through Takeda Taijin's biography of her, which was reprinted in his collected works in 1972. I think so because Taijin's leftist politics, his previous work depicting Japanese and wartime China, which he was interested in, his literary debt to Lu Xun, and the fact that he published this with Chikama Publishing House in the same year that Tomiyama published her own autobiography with them. Another intrepid feminist whose books appear in a collage was the cosmopolitan global traveler Agnes Smedley, clearly, like Tomiyama herself, a wandering minstrel as well as a thoroughly modern individual. Very involved with Asia, a journalist, successful one, very independent, and a person with a fierce and lifelong celebration of working class solidarity transnationally. She was born in an impoverished mining town in Missouri, but then traveled the world. These are the German editions of two of her books from the 1930s. China's Red Army Marches and China Fights Back are the English titles. And unexpectedly, Smedley's translator of a third book on China was Takasugi Ichiro, who also translated the Robert Graves Greek myths that I mentioned a few minutes ago. He was, like Takeda, a major left-wing intellectual who had been an editor at Kaizosha, then was in China, was captured by the Soviets and repatriated to Japan in 1949, and is most famous for his memoir about Siberian internment. And if you've read Andrew Barchet's recent book on this, he explains Takasugi's 1950 work In the Shadow of Northern Lights, which Barchet glosses as knowledge painfully acquired, tried to think through his experience as a Japanese soldier, a man of words, and a human being who both takes responsibility for his own role in and is trapped by the history of his time. So I don't know if Tomiyama read this memoir, but it's famous enough to assume that someone with her politics and intellectual engagement was aware of it. But this is the community to which she is tying her work. Rebecca Jennison has explained that Tomiyama returned to Smedley in 2015 when she created a similar new collage, which actually I don't have up here. I don't have it, but these are some of the pieces for it, for a group show held in Berlin, which she created for the German audience in mind. Tomiyama was then 94 years old. This time she highlighted the artist, John Hartfield, who created the two book jackets, China Blue Tip there is one of them, and who had pioneered collage and photomontage as techniques in his journalism and his art when he was a major figure in Weimar, Germany. He was an early Dadaist. He collaborated with George Grosz, Otto Dix, Bertolt Brecht. He's not just a very famous figure, but one that she had been following since her student days. And he is, of course, a participant in the long satirical tradition of mocking humanity by creating eerie, partially human creatures. There's one of his and one of hers right below it. The final paintings in the puppet series introduce the theme of environmental degradation, a fairly late development in Tomiyama's work. They were inspired by two events: the massive earthquake that triggered a tsunami in Southeast Asia in December 2004, which killed several 100,000 people, and the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center towers on September 11th, 2001. This included two oil paintings inspired by news photographs of the devastated low-lying Maldive Islands. And so that's just a photo, so you can see. And then that's her, one in gold and one in green, that focused on the detritus left behind after the tsunami's advance and retreat. The cataclysmic event revealed how the sea jumbles human creations. In her narrative, the puppets were swept away by an even bigger tidal wave than the forces of industrialization and colonialism, and then were washed up on shore, festooned with lost artifacts, and baubles. The human-animal divide is breached in other ways as well, such as the inclusion of Tsuda Satoru's kitten dioramas from the 1980s, which are in there, you can see, which feature pictures of actual kittens dressed in clothing that marks them as members of Japan's youth culture. I haven't quite figured this one out, but why she put kitten cosplay into her painting, but I can report that the internet provides a very deep wormhole devoted to this subject. The last painting evokes the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. It's a somber warning that time is short if humans do not change their ways. She thought of this as her last series at the time, but then later she was inspired by the Fukushima disaster and created a whole nother series, a topic for another day. But in this painting, In Toxic Seas, she is invoking not just the center of global capitalism, the World Trade Center, but also an oil field fire, destroying the atmosphere as it provides the pretext for yet another war. Yet the skeletons of birds who were smothered in oil and are now picking their way through a graveyard of computer keyboards are oddly cheerful. They tap out the message, "Let us have light." This painting was included in the recent 8th Yokohama Triennale, which was organized around the theme of wild grass, our lives, in homage to a book by Liu Shun, which he produced when he lived in Japan as a young man. There were 93 artists involved in it, and the Beijing-based curator selected them because they speak of humble humanism, courage, resilience, faith, and solidarity. They wanted to showcase art that evoked both past and potentially future moments of a peaceful, productive relationship between Japanese and Chinese people, such as the woodblock print movement of the 1930s that had centered on Liu Shun's circle of friends, who included Agnes Smedley, and larger themes such as the relationships between humans and the natural environment. And so I was very happy to see how fully they recognized and valued the themes Tomiyama hoped to convey. And that strikes me that successful transmission of an artist's political stance is the final part of what makes an aesthetic statement good political art. The visual beauty and sophistication with which it is conveyed is central, so is the moral clarity of the message. And in Tomiyama's work, these qualities are established in part by how the series engages so many cultural contexts and political debates of the last half century in a coherent and thoughtful synthesis. This is in turn made possible by the originality, cultural specificity, and depth of knowledge she brings to her cultural production. More simply, this is smart and witty work that is also gorgeous to look at. And that's what makes it good political art. And let me leave you with an image that you've only seen a portion of, the curtain call for the theater performance Under the Sea. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. So following our usual practice, in the seminar series, the first question goes to an associate of the program. So I'll ask Jesus Solis, who's one of our postdoctoral fellows, to ask the first question. He's working on a project entitled America's Black Market of Empire in the Asia Pacific Region, 1945 to 1975. So Jesus, please.
Thank you, Professor Hein, for the fascinating talk. I wanted to ask about this important point that you brought up at the end of your presentation about how these major historical events had a big impact on Tomiyama's works at the end of her life. You had mentioned the 2011 terrorist attacks, the tsunami in 2004, and also the Fukushima disaster. And you had talked about that with her trip to Central Asia in 1967. And you also mentioned that she was very interested in Asian societies, imperialism, and war. So I would imagine that the ongoing Vietnam War at the time would have had a big impact. And although you mentioned a lot about kind of how China appears in her works, I didn't see so much about Southeast Asia or Vietnam. So I was curious how the Vietnam War, if that had an impact on any of her work at that time or perhaps later.
She was not such a big activist in the anti-war movement, but her collaborator, Takahashi Yuji, was hugely involved. And he's a musical composer and gifted pianist. And he started the Water Buffalo Quartet, I think it was called, Water Buffalo something, that was musicians from across Asia, and they performed at Beijing events and things like that. So he is central to the major anti-war movement in Japan. She was paying attention to it. She was much more active with the Korean democracy movement at that era. She was working for Amnesty in Asia. Her images are on the Japanese translation of Kim Chi-ha's poems. And so that was her main political focus of the day. Got to pick something. Alas, there are many choices.
So now I'd like to open up to the floor, and then also to those of us who are joining us on Zoom for questions, comments. Susan.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I wonder if you could say a few words about the critical reception of her work. And it did strike me that, as I understand it, the collages are considered to be one of her great contributions. And you referenced Hieronymus Bosch, whom I'm a great fan of, and his work, Garden of Earthly Delights, is the #1 thing viewed in the Prado. But one of the reasons is because the viewer looks at it and it references something very familiar to even simple people. There's Adam and Eve. There is, everyone knows that people are punished terribly for their sins. All of fiery hell, all of these images are in people's minds. So they get it, even though there's a lot to be explained to them. do you think, is there an audience to which she is speaking who do immediately get it? I found it can be explained to me, but I don't get it.
So how culturally literate are people is really the question, I suppose, right? So she references things, much of her art is Buddhist or Taoist and Ebisu. Most people in Japan know who Ebisu is, I think, and have a sense of that. So that would be a layer that is easily recognizable by most people. If you continue to go deeper into it, there will be things that not everybody will know, I suppose. Internationally, her work is not so easy to interpret, I think. I had an exhibit of her work in 2006, where the central theme was people being deceived by foxes. So again, the idea that a fox is deceitful and clever there's a European version, they're just really smart. And so it, I think, comes from nature, but it's both European and Asian. But my students or the visitors to this exhibit thought the foxes were cute, and they are not. They are malicious in her version of them. And that made me realize that it does need more interpretation, and that images you don't control the valence of them, but art in general doesn't try to fix it completely. That ability to move it is part of what continues to give it power. So I don't think you can nail it down 100% and have it still function emotionally powerfully. And that's the challenge.
Oh, and please introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm Mayako. I'm a PhD student in Stream Speech and Languages program. So I was really interested by the kind of feminist perspectives that the artist brought into her work. And I guess my question is why she predominantly kind of used the feminist perspective in interpreting tradition and myths instead of maybe other topics or other motifs, and how you evaluate how she's doing that visually, like how you see her, also how you see her feminist perspectives maybe changing over time.
She is a feminist. And it is because the conditions of her life were entirely different because she was born female than if she had been born male. And many things like becoming a professional artist, which she knew she wanted to do as a child, was much, much more difficult for that reason. And so it's funny, she didn't really speak English at all, but she said, when we were talking about this issue, she said, yes, when I discovered feminism, and then she said in English, the scale fell from my eyes. So how did she pick feminism? She discovered it, and it made her own life make sense to her. And then after that, there is no going back once you've had that experience. And that is, so she wanted to convey how central that was to everything she has thought about since then. What issues within feminism that may shift over time, but the fundamental commitment to it that's what I mean by saying she is a political person. She doesn't do political things. It is central to her identity. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Koichi Nakano with the US Japan program. My question is a little bit I guess in terms of its angle connected to what Jesus and Susan asked. And I'm sort of trying to figure out whether it's possible to identify some sort of cultural or maybe geographical is not the right word, but expansion in her work and the interest in terms of I mean, an easy label that comes up in my mind obviously is Asia,
Mhm.
but Asia is such a sort of other notion that Asians normally don't think of themselves as Asians, or they mean different things when they think of Asia. And so presumably that's not exactly what she had in mind. And so maybe it still is defined in terms of something against capitalism, for example, or modernity, or industry, or war, violence, what have you. But and I'm sure part of the reason why she's such a great political artist is because it's not quite possible to verbalize what that is very easily. But I'm curious in terms of, is there any sort of common thread, or is there anything that you with your work are able to sort of get a sense of what is it that's sort of driving her in terms of her political?
So this is layered on top of an earlier set of concerns that I didn't go into in this talk, but I've written about elsewhere. When she went to art school in 1938, he was in the Eurocentrism of art education and the way in which you could either do Japanese art or you could do European art was very frustrating to her because she liked oil painting and European style art. And obviously her cultural artistic references were across the board. But she worried that she was copying or was derivative, like people all around the non-Western world have had to struggle with this issue. And it was only when she visited first Latin America and then Asia that she said she felt like she really got a handle on this problem and was developing her own visual language that had imagery that came from those places to free herself of that. And she actually didn't paint for 20 years straight. So in the 1970s, she was also not producing paintings, which actually I think the paintings rather than the collage are her masterworks. They're huge. So imagine a refrigerator door size. That's how big they are. That kind of freed her to start saying things in a different kind of way. And then this series is after she's more or less completed that transition.
Yes.
Hi, I am Maria Salvador. I'm an art historian from the HAA department, focusing on medieval Japan. So thank you for this incredible talk. I am very interested, it's kind of a follow-up of what you're saying, very interested in the technical aspects to see if, I hear that she was interested in oil painting and all of this, but since she is also in conversation with tradition, I wonder if she also did it in terms of technique. And also the link with Latin America, it actually makes so much visual sense now that you've said it. So I was wondering if you know specific artists that she liked or that she felt influenced by?
So there are a ton of skeletons in some of her other work, and there's clearly Jose Posada and the muralist tradition in Mexico. She was also in Peru and in Brazil, and looking at both modern art and pre-Columbian art there. So this is a year-long trip she made in 1960-61. She went to Cuba as well. And so she's thinking about the public art traditions in each of these places and bringing art to the people. She had worked she was a journalist, that's how she supported herself. And she worked for the Coal Miners Union newspaper. Tanro had a daily newspaper in addition to a monthly journal. And I remember working in not the daily paper, but the monthly and weekly paper for my dissertation research in the 1980s, and being astonished at the high quality of the artwork in those publications, which I now know there are a lot of people working on this topic right now, and recreating the artistic movements that were showing up. And at the time, I had no idea how to think about them.
But she was not doing artwork for them, but she was doing reportage for them. After the Mikkei strike, everybody's exhausted. A whole fairly large group of miners went to Latin America because they lost their jobs. They were all blacklisted. There were no more work in the mines. And so there was a big effort to locate them in Latin America. And then she went to see how they were doing in their new home. And that was the work that she was doing that was paying for this trip. But she was personally using it to re-energize herself artistically.
Hi, Marimira from Restaurant Institute, and thank you very much for your fascinating talk. And could you explain a little bit more about the legacies and influence or inspiration that Tomiyama has left to contemporary political art or political movement in Japan? Because when I hear the name of Tomiyama Taeko, I usually remember the prints about the comfort women and also the Guangzhou uprising and so on. And among contemporary feminists in Japan, I think she's been remembered as someone who was so powerful about visualizing those events, and also transnational, the feminist network between Japan and South Korea. But you didn't introduce those of these, and instead you introduced more sort of subtle political art compared to comfort women and the Guangzhou uprising. That's so political. So I'm glad to see that she has so much variety of her work. So my question is, so because of such great variation and also impact on contemporary feminists, what sort of the legacies and inspiration using them?
So that is indeed her most famous work, is on the military comfort women, and that's how she became well known, and she did it really early. So her work is 1986-88. This is before Kim Hudson came forward and said, yes, this happened to me, and then others did as well. And so she was really one of the pioneers, and she was working with Matsuya Yori and really early person to bring that to public attention. But she never really made it big in the art world, and better after that than before. And one of the nice things about her living so long is that she was much more widely known in her late years than she would have been otherwise. But her career is really kind of just taking off now that she's passed away. I'd say the most active area of research right now is on her work on Korean political support movement and on Korean miners. So the work that I first saw in 1984 was on coal miners that she had done. And visually, it looks a lot like Kaita Kolowitz, and it also takes up themes, woodblock print things. These are lithographs mainly. And she went down the mines then. One of the mines that she went into, there were they'd punched through to a Kofun era tomb, and there were paintings on the wall, accidentally. And so she realized that there was this underground connection. Of course, Korean, Japanese, those boundaries weren't the same back in that era, that was going on. And then she also connected it to the forced laborers during World War II. And so there's a fair amount of work going on now on how those things are connected in her work, some of which was found in her studio after she died that she had forgotten about and everybody else had never known about. And so there's an exhibit being created related to that, and other people working on that right now. That's the single biggest thing I know of.
Well, we're just about out of time, so to urgent last minute questions, so perhaps we'll wrap up here. Thanks so much, Laura, for really fascinating talk. Nice images, yeah. Usually we get bar graphs, so this is just a real treat.
I knew I was gonna give you good stuff to look at.
Okay, so please join me in thanking